I trust that you've enjoyed your lunch break. You're feeling re-energized ahead of our next session. Probably going to be as interesting as those that were earlier on. We're always mindful of the impacts of your having had lunch, but fortunately, it would not have been a buffet as we would have in a live event that literally did serve to make our eyelids rather heavy after the for what we would call the graveyard session. So certainly this is not going to be one of those. And this afternoon we're going to focus on public sector procurement, the construction sector, and for that we have a fantastic lineup of industry leaders on our panel. And we would like to thank them in advance for their time and expertise, and certainly these industry leaders in various sectors, both local and international. So certainly we look forward to sharing what is international best practice with you, our listeners, this afternoon. Without further ado, let me introduce to you our next facilitator. Is Dr. Almost there yet, sorry, Gift, Mr. Gift Mpefu. I do know that he's busy finishing off his PhD, so that was a bit of a Freudian slip. Gift is the Managing Director of MedTech Engineers, registered professional engineer, also a member of the Institution of Electrical Engineering, and he holds a BSc in Electrical and Electronics Engineering for UKZN, and currently is finalizing his PhD with the Graduate School of Engineering Management at the University of Johannesburg. So Gift, please join me, and if you would all join me in welcoming Gift to the podium. Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you so much, colleagues, for making time to stick around for this session. I guess it's a very, very important session for most of us in this platform today, because this is how we engage with the client out there. You know, procurement, it's that medium that serves as that initial interface between us as consultants or contractors with the clients. But colleagues, we know that government has an obligation to address infrastructure needs of the citizens. And of course, it achieves this through procurement of engineering services. Now, regardless of the size of the engineering consulting firm or the construction company, there are common experiences shared by these entities, especially when it comes to procurement within the public sector environment. One, we've heard of situations where there's been delays or even non-payment following the service that has been rendered to some of our public sector clients. Two, some of the RFPs are not put together in a way that is clear for everyone to understand and clear for everyone to price. We know that there is an absence of a systematic way in which we can get to engage with the local subcontractors, or some people call them the business forums. We have those as stakeholders out there in the communities, and the absence of a proper framework makes it difficult for all of us to operate. There is lack of collaboration between the clients and the engineering professionals, sometimes due to competency issues from either side. So the problem is not only from the client side, but you may find that some of the professionals assigned to projects do not necessarily possess competencies. So surely all of these factors threaten the sustainable development of infrastructure and the economic growth potential of our country. That is just to say the least. For me, this makes a case for a session like this one, for us to invest a little bit of time and really explore our topic. So we have some fine speakers today who are really qualified to address us on this topic. The idea is to deal with all questions you may have after all speakers have done their presentations. But I just need to get clarity from our first speaker, that is Dr. Miriam. I know that she had some pressing commitments for the afternoon, and if time still allows her, we can deal with, with her questions in the Q&A session. Otherwise, we'll take 1 or 2 questions immediately after her presentation. So our first speaker, Dr. Miriam Altman, has deep experience in economic policy research, and she also has a lot of experience in the transformation. She is currently leading National Infrastructure 50. She was a national president in 2020. Economy on infra. Previously head of infrastructure and regulatory affairs at Chapel, responsible for crafting and orchestrating its turnaround. Miriam is a director of Altman Advisory and a professor of the 4th Industrial Revolution practice at the University of Johannesburg. She has economics degrees from Cambridge and Manchester universities. Dr. Altman will be speaking about how infrastructure can act as a driver to economic recovery and growth with insights from the NIP 2050. Please, let's welcome Dr. Altman. The stage is yours, ma'am.
Thanks so much for having me. I thought in this invitation I should focus on what the National Infrastructure Plan for 2050 is doing. I've been working with Infrastructure South Africa on it in government. So the first thing is many of you may have already been in one of the stakeholder sessions. We've been doing a bit of a roadshow for the past, since the middle of August, to many stakeholders. That's why I've got to jump off early today, unfortunately. So the National Infrastructure Plan looks to 2050. It's going to be done in two blocks. The first one, which was issued for public feedback in August, focuses on 4 areas really of more bulk infrastructure, big platform types of investments. It focuses on energy, water, freight transport, and digital telecommunications. The time for public comments was extended to October 1st, which is Friday, so there still is time. This was available, and the organizers must have a copy if you don't. Certainly happy to share a link to it, but it is also on the Public Works and government printers site, so it is publicly available. The way that we went about this, and I should say that there's going to be a second round of planning, which then looks at the more distributed kind of infrastructure, municipal infrastructure, and including commuter transport. So when you're giving comments and you're thinking about this, please be aware that we've split it up into 2 for functional reasons. We just think that it's delivered in different ways and the stakeholder engagement is different. So we wanted to do this part first. Now, what it does is it gives a vision for 2050, but then it has a very strong emphasis on the strategic infrastructure projects and makes very specific recommendations in respect of them, and then makes very specific recommendations for 3-year actions. I should say that there are some cross-cutting themes that arise out of all 4 sectors, and those really focus on building capacity. The first big area is related to knowledge services, and we use that as an umbrella expression, which speaks to capability in planning, monitoring, budgeting, finance, procurement, which I know is the topic of this session, project preparation, project management, and sector-specific innovation. In fact, all of these areas are critical to succeeding in procuring major infrastructure and overseeing its delivery. And as we know, the state is quite weak and has become weaker over time. I've spoken to this community a few times as a National Planning Commissioner because we instigated this work under that hat, and this is why CESA asked me to do this work once I stepped off the Planning Commission, because we drove quite hard this question of what specifically needs to be in place to make sure that there is at least minimum high-level capacity within the state. The second and third broad area that are linked is related to strengthening public and private cooperation. In the document, we often use the term PPP, but we don't mean that specifically, and we may edit that. We really just mean strengthening public and private cooperation, of which there really is very little right now, and also strengthening blended project finance. And we have a whole section in the document focused on strengthening finance, so that by 2050, maybe about a third of public infrastructure spending is financed by the private sector. The fourth area is related to strengthening executive management and technical capability within the state and its entities. The fifth area is related to strengthening economic regulation. Sixth is related to driving greater efficiency in infrastructure design and delivery, with greater attention to life cycle and maintenance considerations. And then finally, there's a very big emphasis on industrial development and localization. Excuse me. Now, just for the topic of this session to zero in, and I'm happy to answer any, you may have already read the plan, and you may have any other questions, which I'm very happy to answer, but this session was titled How to Get Better Value for Money Out of Public Procurement, which is a very good question. And I just wanted to lift up some of the issues that we highlight. Many of these come from, were sourced originally from the work that we did in the National Planning Commission, and that work is available on the National Planning website, which I'd be happy to share a link. So the first is related to, as I was already saying, of strengthening the cohort of public sector professionals registered with built environment bodies and councils, which is exceptionally thin at the moment and has thinned out over time. You can buy it in and you can get consultants to help you, but the reality is there needs to be these people within the public sector, as you know, as part of a community of professionals. And what we're trying to do through the National Infrastructure Plan is really to drive that message home as really a top priority, because without that, it's very hard to progress on any of the other parts. The second broad area is client delivery managers who lead infrastructure projects with a single point of accountability, who have appropriate certification. The third area is that IPDM should be focused on value for money rather than least cost, with a consideration of the project lifecycle. Now, when I present, generally to stakeholder groups, I often have to explain what I mean, but I'm convinced that the community here knows exactly what I mean. But if not, happy to go through it. Fourth, infrastructure supply chain management should become more of a strategic function rather than a back office or a purely financial or administrative function. This is something, when I was chief of strategy at Telcom, helping to lead the turnaround from 2013 to 2016 for Sipo Maseko. This was one of the first things that we did, actually, was to lift the procurement function out from the shadows and from a kind of juniorization where it was also very easy to hide fraud, into an exco level function where we brought in somebody who had strategic procurement and supply chain capability, and the function was completely transformed. This is actually one of the ways of dealing with corruption as well. People are often asking us, how do you deal with corruption? And a big way of dealing with corruption is not only to take people to court, but it is also to have in place strong professionals, an elevated procurement function that is very transparent, and transparent reporting, which is another recommendation of the NIP, by the way. Then finally, it suggested that the IPDM be delinked from centralized purchasing and led by a chief procurement officer or high-level office specifically mandated and capacitated with built environment professionals. So that doesn't mean taking away the functions of the CFO, but rather recognizing the kind of professional capability needed for these very complex projects. Now, we also have quite a lot of focus on rebuilding the civil construction and supplier sector. One of the big areas of feedback, we had this in the work we were doing in the National Planning Commission as well, and that was repeated in the feedback to us with the sector, was firstly that strengthening the capacity of the state in the way outlined, as I've outlined, and the other things that are in the National Infrastructure Plan is probably one of the most important things we could do to stimulate the industry back to health. Also, clarity in the project pipeline with follow through into bankability, but that's of course linked to the capacity in the state. That there's a transparent database of strategic projects is one of the best ways of creating accountability and improving the flow of projects and enabling civil society and the private sector to be able to weigh in on where things are, who's getting awarded, and weighing in on the veracity of progress. And then finally, that Infrastructure South Africa should act as a national infrastructure champion, including driving removal of red tape and easing the cost of doing business. So key points that I wanted to lift up. I tried to be brief, and I hope that it does stimulate maybe some feedback or comments from the group. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Altman. It was really insightful. Let me see if there are any questions in the Q&A. Okay, there's a question here from Anton Kloppers. There is a great attention to life cycle and maintenance. So the question is, when can we expect to see the statutory fee scales for member firms? This important aspect. Would you be able to comment on that?
I think that is maybe more specific than what we're dealing with. I think we're making the point that this needs to happen. It is not how things are done. And subject to cabinet approval, hopefully in November, this is something that would need to get taken up to say, what does that mean? That's when private sector and civil society can then weigh in and say, well, this is what you've accepted you're going to do. And in our view, this is what it would involve. But we're in the National Infrastructure Plan not dealing with that level of detail at this point.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think in your presentation, sorry, go ahead.
I would suggest, the way of engaging with something like a National Infrastructure Plan is to be making these kinds of comments. So even if you submit and we don't put it into the National Infrastructure Plan, because the document by design is short, it's meant to be very focused. But that doesn't mean, we're trying to short circuit the planning period so that we get moving as soon as possible. And what I would encourage the private sector to do and private organizations such as yourselves is to then be actively engaging with CESA, which is very open to this kind of engagement, to be saying, well, in your view, thank you for wanting to adopt this life cycle approach. In our view, this is how it could work. Can we engage on it? And to be forceful on that point, and they're open to that. They want that engagement and advice. Just to say.
Yeah.
We're trying to stay away from details specifically, because what that does then is it takes away from the big ideas.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that input. And I noticed in your presentation that the NIP 2050, there are some clear action plans, at least for the immediate 3 years to come. And that you focus on the 4 sectors, the energy, water, transport, and telecoms. So are you able to give us an indication of what are some of the, the initiatives that are going to take place in the next 3 years or so?
Oh, sure. I mean, I could have presented on the whole thing. We've been presenting to stakeholders across the country. I probably do 2 or 3 presentations a day in sessions. I don't think I'm going to have space. I won't do justice to it. But just to give you an idea, what we do is we, in the next 3 years, what we do is we firstly have reviewed all of the relevant strategic infrastructure projects, in other words, the SIPs. We make specific recommendations for how they should be augmented or changed. And we make very specific recommendations for the next 3 years as to what needs to happen in the meantime, with a very significant focus on the institutional capacity questions, which are the number one biggest barrier to success. But more specifically, there are things like like in energy, as an example, we make very specific recommendations for a change in orientation towards more environmental and financial sustainability in the energy mix, and that we need to start moving towards a greater portion of renewables, a greater portion of storage. We're very, very specific about how much needs to be procured by 2050, by 2030, and therefore in the next 3 years, and in what way. So for example, fewer bid windows, just as an example. So there are very particular, I'm just giving one example.
Yeah.
And when we get to the municipal area, we'll also look at it that way. But we're pretty specific, and it takes me about half an hour to go through the whole thing. So I would hate to dumb it down, but that gives you an idea of the kind of recommendations that we make. And so if I can just, through you as the chair, Nicholas is asking, what about blended project finance? How much? That's a good example of where we're saying, the reality is that 2% of public infrastructure is currently financed by the private sector, and most of that is office accommodation. So that means that there's actually very little private finance that is coming through. We're suggesting that is dramatically changed, but it's not going to dramatically change in 3 years. We're saying that by 2050, we hope that there will, that we think that to fill the funding gap and achieve a sort of 6 trillion rand budget by 2040 anyway, that 1/3 of that finance gap really will have to be filled with the private sector funding. But of course, it's going to take time to develop that capacity, to make the rules of the game more effective and have a state that is more able to partner. And we lift up the ability to partner as one of the capacities that really needs to be strengthened. It's partly an improvement of the regulatory environment, but there also just needs to be a certain capability and interest and willingness and capability to work together and be receptive to innovative projects and approaches. So in the next 3 years, which is sort of a question, it's unlikely to change completely, but one does hope that it is going to progress. Then what we also have to remember is that people treat the state like it's bankrupt, and it's not. There's over, I forget what's in the budget now. It used to be a lot more, but there has to be over 700 billion rand in the medium-term expenditure framework over the next 3 years for infrastructure. It used to be quite a bit higher than that, but still, that's a lot of money. So if we were able to even get better value for money within that spending, that would make an enormous difference to this country and to your sector. And to the general feeling that we're progressing.
All right. So thanks for that input. The last question here is Andre van der Walt. He's asking the question whether are you considering the quality-based procurement model for procurement of consulting engineers in the future?
I think that's another example of where I think the industry should really be approaching CESA to make very detailed and specific recommendations about how they go about it. But it's not something that we're specifically looking at in the National Infrastructure Plan. If Andre or others feel that we should, please suggest. But if not, then that's certainly something that could be considered after.
All right. So thank you so much, Dr. Altman. I think we really enjoyed your insights, and thank you very much for making time. We know that you have other constraints, other commitments to attend to. So thank you so much for having you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you. So our next speaker is a professional engineer joining us from Florida in the USA. He has been involved in leading the design and construction of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, coordinating the budget planning cycle of the Secretary of Defense, and managing major acquisition programs. He has over 36 years experience, and after a long, impactful career at high levels within private sector firms and US government public services, Mark retired to devote his efforts to improving his business environment for the consulting engineering industry. And when not involved with engineering issues, Mark and his wife, Linda, divide their time between spoiling their grandchildren and traveling the world. So let's welcome Mark. Mark, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I am excited to be here for you this afternoon, for me this morning, to advocate for what I truly believe in, and that's qualifications-based selection. I will immediately go into the slides because my time is short and there's much to cover. Please feel free to challenge and question anything that I say during this session and later in correspondence. I'll provide information to reach me at the end of this slideshow. I'm sure that you have an idea of what QBS is. I just want to very quickly run through it. It is a competitive procedure that emphasizes quality and precludes price considerations during the selection process. Why use QBS? Especially for infrastructure development, physical infrastructure development. Each project is unique. And when I say unique, the soils, the weather, the utility locations, all of these factors bear into the fact that physical infrastructure needs to be project specific. The longevity of the projects, meant to last decades, if not longer. The high cost of the construction and the length of time to do any changes or remediations are prohibitive. Poor project performance is something that you have to then live with. And any project loss or lack of use is significant. And bottom line is, you can't prototype this. This isn't like building a weapons system or a software system or all that. You got to get this right the first time. And this is what QBS allows you to do. It also focuses you, and I'm going to run through these slides very quickly, team building, attracting technology and innovation, and competition based on best performers, not low bidders. Best team for the project and efficient use of staff. Who benefits from QBS? The client, the government, in many cases. The effect that the design has on, as was talked to by Dr. Altman and all that, is life cycle costs, construction costs, bringing in social issues, sustainability, safety. It also allows the government to grow industry competency within that framework. And also, again, on the financing side, attracting third-party financing because of the quality of the final projects. The public, it's efficient use of tax revenues. And I'll get into that much more later. And better infrastructure. And the industry, it encourages the industry itself to invest and develop capabilities. It allows you to pay salaries to hold on to people, to have benefits that attract people, and to basically have the tools, software, computers, everything else to function well. And it creates stability because the better firms are getting the work. A quick look, and I'm sure there'll be people who'll correct me if I'm wrong. I didn't have a lot of time to study this, but it appears that under your Constitution, these 5 pillars of procurement really all QBS fits into them. So that isn't a problem. But when I look at the framework for infrastructure delivery and procurement management, it seems to be focused on the client or the government, or excuse me, in this case, the government, defining the concepts, detailing the design requirements, and it really does not take full advantage of the private sector. And this is where QBS would come in. And let me quickly go into the US history to possibly show what I'm talking about here. Up to about 80 years ago, most of the design work by the federal government was done by federal employees. They found that they couldn't have the expertise for every project, the local expertise, the differing conditions, just the different abilities that keep popping up and being required to be put into the designs. So they developed contracting methods to work with the private sector. And this created a need for cooperation and all that, but it really didn't grow into QBS until we actually came up with a system for getting quality in. It was still predominantly, how would you say, I won't say managed, but actually overseen by the federal government to the extent that innovation, thought, and other was hampered. In 1972, the Brooks Act, which was the original QBS, came about, and it basically took pricing out of the selection, not the contracting, but the selection. It became in 1984, it became a full recognized competition alternative and actually a competition use for the architect engineering sector. And I will get into that a little more. Since then, it's been redefined and defined so that whenever any federal dollars are involved in a project, whether it's at a state or local level through grants and other things, you still have to use QBS. In 1984, I said the decision was made that based on a number of significant failures in major structures that affected not only public safety, but economy and the lifestyles of people, it really, the decision was made that low bid should not be used for architect engineers, and this became the sort of the guiding reference. To give you an example, the states have, in the US, the states, we're a federation, so the states control a lot of the licensing, in fact, all of the licensing of engineers and engineering firms. In Texas, it became, after the loss of a school due to design problems, that basically wiped out a generation of students from kindergarten through what we call high school prior to university. And they now have one of the strictest QBS laws and licensing requirements. And if somebody provides pricing information as part of their submittal on a response to a request, they lose their license. So this gives you how severe how seriously it's taken. Who uses QBS in the US? It started really at the federal government, and it's now down to state and local levels. Private industry uses it when they want to make sure that they've got the right teams, the right people, the right firms, the right stability, and it's going across the board and getting more and more use throughout. Who endorses it? Notable, the American Public Works Association. That is the clients when you're coming to public works. They endorse it emphatically because they get better projects. The International Federation of Consulting Engineers says it is the best practice and are advocating for it around the world. Of course, ACEC in the US, being the business association in the US, but also the Bar Association, the Architects, the Professional Engineering Society, and many other professional technical societies. I won't get into this in much detail, but what's notable about how QBS is defined under US law, it is not just the work done by professional architects, engineers, but it's also any services incidental and logically and justifiably performed by architect engineers or their employees. So it goes into everything from soils understanding to plans and specifications, but also studies and similar activities, and also for surveying and mapping when it affects real property use. Engineering services in our philosophy are not services that are commodity based. They are professional services requiring technical expertise, innovation, use of the latest technologies, professional competence, and also ethics and public safety and care and considerations. Let's look at the designs themselves. What impacts it? Obviously, the client's desires, the client's budget, but there's also the fact that there are many varying different engineering and architectural solutions to the problems, to the satisfying the needs of the client. As we talked before, the physical conditions, the environment, the skill levels of the future users and operators. This whole list, all the way down to security and resilience considerations, all affect the designs. You need a cooperative framework and an understanding of desired outcomes and flexibility to achieve that, and that's what QBS provides. Why not lose local? These are some cute little things here just to establish a thought. A lot of people, even in the US, every time there's a new decision maker at maybe a city level, a county level, even up to the federal government, their first thing is, well, low bid seems logical. It is, until you realize that it doesn't get you the best results. And I'll go a little bit later as to it actually, in many cases, in almost most cases, increases the overall project costs, especially when you start talking about ownership costs through the lifetime of a project and its use. Price, whenever it's there, in our experience, it overwhelms the selection decisions. Everybody seems to tend in that direction, and we've got lots of studies to prove it that I can get into later. The biggest hurdle is the fact that in order to get fair pricing, you need fixed scope of work, which means a lot of the decision making, a lot of the design is somewhat defined when you go into this in order to get reasonable prices and comparative prices. And also, it takes out the negotiations of that scope of work until after contract awards. So you're now negotiating with a single entity, no competition at that point. It forces the offerers to compromise on what they're doing, find the minimum standard, limit innovation, who you put on the project, looking at alternatives, and also it encourages risk-taking. And that risk-taking oftentimes ends up affecting the ability of the offerer to complete their work or to do it properly. And this comes to haunt you. Let's look at A services in based on analysis. When you talk about total ownership costs, is usually averages around 0.5% to 1%. It's more and more. It's as we add more considerations into the design, it's going down below 1% of the project lifecycle costs. That includes the construction through operations and use and demolition. With that in mind, even paying a little more makes a lot of sense to get different alternatives looked at to fully understand what can and can't be done in the design to achieve the best projects. Just a cute little thing here to show that in everyday decisions, you balance wants, needs, quality, and budget. Lots of people would love a expensive sports car, but what their focus might be on is saving a buck and getting something that's out of the used car lot, when in fact you need something that just accomplishes the needs and functions that are required. And what does an owner really require? Performance and long-term value, especially out of the designs. Here, some common misconceptions that come up is that QBS takes longer. No, it takes a lot of time out of the beginning, because what you're focusing really are on the qualifications and how you're going to make the selection on those qualifications. It fosters the teamwork, which ends up better understanding of the final scope that you're doing, and cutting back on the time and all for false ideas and for the need for changes. Does it waste taxpayer money? Again, low bid costs everybody in the end. And when you're talking about infrastructure, physical infrastructure, you can't discount the impact of it on public safety, the economy. Just consider, pipeline systems and transportation systems that fail, and what that does to the overall lives of people. And it eliminates price competition. That is directly false, because the owner and the offerer negotiate the scope and what's contained in it, and work towards a fair pricing, and there's no contract awarded until those negotiations complete. If in fact they can't be completed, you go to the next most qualified offer. But there's a lot of incentive after spending time and money for the offerer and the client to come to a fair and reasonable cost. The time and effort on the front end, just in the qualifications development, is significant. What does price competition tell competing offers? It's a loud note that the client cares more about the cost of those services than the final long-term costs and the overall performance. There's a lot of potential when you've got price as a selection factor in underbidding of work, maybe by misunderstanding of the intents and the needs of the client and the scope of work, or intentionally to be able to ask for changes later when they recognize that the client really doesn't want what's in that scope of work. Also, decisions made by clients that tend to focus on costs often affect the final project and hurt the office's reputation. So there are considerations. A lot of people are saying, well, low bid or quality and cost-based selection are the way to go. Again, this non-optimizes the physical infrastructure. And when I say optimize, I'm not saying the sports car, I'm saying the actual transportation mode that's needed, in the analogy that I used before. It also, by having the price factor, it weakens the knowledge-based industry in the country. And let's face it, that affects future infrastructure and the economy of the country. Just the loss of sustainability and the higher operating costs and all that affect the budgets going off into the future. And also you end up with facilities that have difficulty being maintained and operated. There are many decisions that are made in the design. It depends on whether you have a large workforce that's can be bought economically. Whether just look at security. Do you go with security that's all smart buildings, sensors, and all that, or do you go with guards? These are decisions made. The materials you use, Do you buy materials that last a long time, are easy to clean, or do you go with cheaper materials? These are just examples of a lot of the decisions that can be made. To the consultants, it spells potential disaster. You can't, your remuneration levels become very thin, your margins, you have to compromise on the quality of services to what you can get away with. The professionals, it's hard to attract, and it's hard to retain when you can't pay decent salaries, when you don't have decent training, can't pay for advanced training, don't provide the tools, the computer systems, and everything else that are necessary. Those are all the things that go when you start forcing down the price. You start looking at rates more than individuals. And it causes economic destabilization, and oftentimes in some countries we've seen a downward spiral in the whole industry. Going back again, the CBS people talk about 10% cost, 20% cost. Cost clouds the scoring no matter what happens. The selections become impacted. A lot of times the technical scores become so close that even the small percentage of the cost becomes the driving factor, even when the intent is there. And as we talked about before, it encourages changes post-award because of the fixed scope. That basically very quickly runs through what I plan to present. I've got about another 20 slides to talk about the U.S. process and how the contracts are negotiated, all the different qualifications factors. One question that Mr. Imparfu mentioned was how does this encourage new competition? And because you're focused on the ability to perform, the qualifications to perform, it does allow firms that have other experience that is relevant to go after different clients, because they're competing based on their qualifications, their expertise, their experience, even sometimes their location and understanding of local requirements. So that's a real factor. Something that often comes up is how do you consistently evaluate? And this requires having both the selection criteria fixed and by having a selection board that is qualified to make those decisions. Oftentimes, as clients are progressing into quality-based selection, they will hire consultants to be on their selection boards who have no conflict of interest, just to ensure that there's a consistent and traceable open procurement. I've got a bunch of questions here, but I'll wait for the questions to come up to do this. One thing that always comes up is, how do we know this works? And we've done a series of long studies, this one being by two major universities in the US, the Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech, and the University of Colorado, and they show the benefit. With that, I will yield my time back to the rest of the speakers. Just to summarize, engineering services are unique. No two design solutions are the same, and the small investment in services yield long-term impacts. And of course, paramount is public safety and the encouragement of competition. With that, let me
have a thorough understanding of what based selection means, especially in the context of the, and it would be nice for us to learn one or two things on that particular framework. Let me use this opportunity to invite our next speaker, Our next speaker is Ismail Kasim, who is a director at CIDB, responsible for performance improvement, development of best practices, standards in the construction industry, the contract recognition scheme, the best practice project assessment scheme, the client recognition scheme, monitoring of economic activity in the construction industry, and the measures sector spending is scheduled. He holds an MSc in project management from University of Pretoria, civil engineering, CSIR, and a training company. He has over 30 years experience in the construction, participates in various SABS committees. Welcome, Mr. Ismail Kasim.
Thank you, Chair. Good day, delegates. Can I just share? Okay. My topic is on the public sector procurement in construction sector in terms of with a view on public sector client performance, and particularly with the value for money in mind. Just a brief overview. I'll just touch on the legislation and a brief view of the framework for procurement. CIDB client recognition scheme for infrastructure procurement, and concluding remarks. Now, the legislation, in terms of the CIDB Act, one of the preambles, whereas the construction industry impacts directly on communities and the public at large, and its improved efficiency and effectiveness will enhance quality, productivity, health, safety, and environmental outcomes, and value for money to the South African society. And another preamble, whereas the specialized and risk-associated nature of construction places and owners on the public sector client to continuously improve its procurement and delivery management skill in a manner that promotes efficiency, value for money, transformation, and the sustainable development of the construction industry. Now, one looks at the draft public procurement bill, what they define as a value for money in relation to the PPP agreement. That I'm not going to go into that. I'm more interested in the relation to infrastructure, which means the optimal use of resources to achieve the intended outcome. Now, if one looks at the value for money from the SIPDM 2015, it looks at the 3 E's. It's the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, which the preambles was talking about or referred to. And if one looks at the economy, we're looking at the cost, and that is upfront in terms of the planning, in terms of the efficiency, it's the implementation, and the effectiveness in terms of the closeout, in terms of the client looks at how well the outputs achieve the desired outcome. The next one, in terms of the value for money, if one looks at the CIDB's infrastructure gateway system, which was published in 2010, it makes a reference to the value for money principle. So it has a history of the procurement developments. If one looks at the SIPDM, that's the Standard for Infrastructure Procurement and Delivery Management of 2015, it speaks about the gateway, the gates, it speaks about the stages, and it also talks about the value for money principle. In terms of the framework for infrastructure delivery and procurement management, FITPIM, same principle. It is, the common thread is value for money. And if one looks at the draft public bill, it's even more prominent in terms of the value for money principle. If one looks at the framework for procurement, and I'm not going to go, this is the common understanding. It is well established within the construction industry among stakeholders, especially amongst the professional service providers. It is right at the top is our constitutional mandate, and then the Public Finance Management Act, as well as the Municipal Finance Management Act and the Triple PFA, the Triple B Act, and the CIDB Act also fits in there. And then in terms of the standard for uniformity, which prescribes a code of conduct for all participants in the procurement and delivery process, which is then also guided by the standard operating procedures, which are governed by or the underlying standards and practice notes. In terms of the legislative framework, that is the overarching requirements. So we are well established and it's well known. And then within the government departments, public sector departments, the governance established in the organization's policies and procedures, that is also well established. And then the standard for uniformity in construction procurement, which the CIDB underwrites, is also well understood. Now, in terms of the delivery management process, also well understood is in terms of the infrastructure planning, because we've got our medium-term expenditure frameworks for the next 3 years, for example. We've got our annual performances, and then we've got the program implementation management, and then the program completion. So those are the 3 stages in terms of the delivery management process. And again, the industry is well versed in terms of the construction procurement regime. On the one side, you're having a strategy in terms of procurement, and then you have the allocation of risk strategy, and that determines in terms of the pricing strategy and our forms of standard forms of contract. We spoke about the development, the social objectives that comes with it within the communities, the challenges we have, and all of these, they then form the framework then to develop the procurement documents with all of these in mind in terms of the best value for money principle. Now, the question arises now is that if in the public sector, these principles and these standards and frameworks are well established, why is it that we still have, for example, underspend of budgets in public sector client departments? And therefore, what I'll do then is I will now go into the CIDB recognition scheme for infrastructure procurement, the framework. As we are all aware, National Treasury is the custodian of procurement reform across government and is the champion of the key legislation that regulates, among others, the financial management and supply chain management. Now, we know that also creates a number of challenges for the industry, because sometimes it is the CIDB's prescripts, or whether it is the National Treasury prescripts that the clients must now conform to. So that is one of the challenges that the CIDB is addressing with National Treasury. But in collaboration with the National Treasury, in terms of the CIDB Act, the CIDB must promote the standardization of procurement processes with regard to the construction industry within the framework of the procurement of policy of government. In other words, within the framework of government, with the National Treasury, with the overarching laws, the CIDB then fits into these laws to promote uniform and ethical standards within the construction industry, including the standard for uniformity in construction procurement and the code of conduct for all parties engaged in the construction procurement. We are all aware also that the CIDB has a national register of contractors, which categorizes contractors in a manner that facilitates public sector procurement. All public sector clients must use CIDB registered contractors in a particular grade and a particular class of works. And also the CIDB Act states that we may establish a register of professional service providers and a professional service provider recognition scheme. Now, the recognition scheme that the CIDB envisaged for the PSP is, for example, based on their performance. So this is now part of how in the future the CIDB envisaged the procurement of consultants, for instance. We're looking at management systems, we're looking at past performances and the like. And also to determine and establish best practices that promote the procurement and delivery management reforms. Very importantly also, the improved industry performance, efficiency and effectiveness, and improve public sector delivery. Now, the framework for establishing the CIDB client recognition scheme in relation to procurement and delivery for public sector construction works is based on the CIDB contractor recognition scheme. What the CIDB contractor recognition scheme entails is, in future, the CIDB will recognize contractors' competencies, the CIDB will recognize their management systems, and the CIDB will recognize their performance in the form of a contractor performance report, which the clients would then complete through the assistance of the client's agent, which is probably in most cases the PSP. The CIDB project assessment scheme, what that entails, it is the platform to where public as well as private sector clients, they contribute to the improvement of the industry, whether it is health and safety, whether it is the application of technology and the like. In terms of the national standard for infrastructure procurement delivery management, we have moved on to now, I think now it is now FIT-PIM, and we're also moving towards the public sector procurement bill, so we have moved on. And then what we've also looked at, we looked at the assessment of international experiences, for example, what other countries are doing. But where are we getting our source from? The information that the CIDB will gather in terms of the scheme, it will come from the CIDB register of projects. All public sector clients are required to register a project above 200,000 Rand on the CIDB register of projects. And for private sector clients above 10 million Rand, as well as state-owned entities, they must register their projects above 10 million Rand, and they must also register the completion of the project. And through that process, that is how the CIDB will then gather the information. The second source of information is the annual performance reports that the clients submit to the National Treasury in every financial year. We will access that. We already do that to some extent, and I'll show you in the other slides. Again, the assessment of the competence of the supply chain management and delivery management officials. We have developed a draft, a CIDB competence framework for construction procurement, and that will be undertaken by recognized professionals meeting criteria which the CIDB will establish and complying to a CIDB code of conduct for the assessors. And also, what we also have drafted so far, it's in draft form, an assessment of the performance of agencies based on the client performance reports. Now, this client performance report will be completed by a professional service provider that was employed as an agent and the construction company, the contractor. So there will be two forms or two reports which will be completed, and that will be an assessment of the performance of the client. We also have a performance for contractors, and we also have a performance in the pipeline for the PSP performance. So we have three. In terms of what the objective is, the primary objective of the scheme is to recognize the capabilities of employers, those are the implementing agencies and public sector institutions, to successfully deliver infrastructure in terms of their capabilities and performance. And those employers with inadequate capability or performance may be required to employ external services or resources to manage construction procurement. And there's an opportunity for the private sector to come on board. And the secondary objective of the scheme is to encourage performance improvement in infrastructure procurement and delivery by the employers based on identified weaknesses. So it is also not just a penalty that will be applied, but it will be an encouragement, it will be capacitation of those clients that have certain weaknesses in their infrastructure procurement systems. Now, what it is based on, the scheme is based on the recognition model. There are quite a number of them. The first one is the percentage project compliance index and certification to SAN 1734. In terms of the compliance, as I mentioned earlier, every client must register a project above 200,000 Rand. If it is a public sector client, if it is a private sector client, it must register above 10 million Rand, as well as a state-owned entity above 10 million Rand. They must submit these on the CIDB ROP, as well as the completion of those projects. Secondly, those clients that call for the certification of SAN 1734, that's a specification for an anti-bribery management system from their suppliers, but it's also extended to fraud and corruption as a best practice. In this case, we are now promoting grade 9 contractors, and as we go along with the consultants, the PSPs, we envisage to employ and have certification to stand 1734 for the large entities or PSPs. In terms of the percentage spend index, that is the percentage infrastructure spend in terms of the budget versus the infrastructure spend. And what we have done, and like I said earlier as well, is we have started with the collection of information and data from National Treasury. If one looks at the municipal expenditure, Chair, you'll see in a financial year, for example, you have figures up to 27 billion rand, which was not spent. Now, that could be due to the lockdown, the COVID-19 event that came upon us. And we'll see how that will improve with the new financial year and the results. But saying that, there is quite a purse available in the public sector to need to be spent. And that creates, if one has to dissect this, it's looking at professional fees, for instance, that fall behind now because the money hasn't been, the funds have not been spent, as well as contractors and also to our previous speaker, for example, if you're looking at sustainability of the profession, whether it is the PSPs or the contractor, if the public sector does not spend, it has a ripple effect. If one looks at the provincial expenditure, for example, again, they are also in this financial year, for example, 3 billion rand that they underspend. If you're looking at the national departments, that is, for example, they've also underspent by 4 million rand. Chair, if you bear with me, the system just standing with me, I have difficulty to present further. Okay, there I go. The public entities, apologies for that, Chair. The public entities, they also did not spend their money in terms of 1 billion rand. They're the least or most effective ones. In terms of the state-owned entities, they are the area or the sector that one has to look at. It is 47 billion rand that has not been spent. And again, it could be because of the result of the lockdown, the COVID-19. Again, it has a huge implication for you as service providers as well as for contractors in terms of what the effect is, the knock-on effect is in terms of sustainability and services provided. Again, there's another index, and that is the price overrun index, which is the actual tender value versus the actual cost versus the tender value. And then again, if you're looking at the time index, it's similar, the number of days in terms of the award, the average days after the tender closing date to the date of the award. So that is what we're also looking at. We're looking at the prompt payment index. We spoke about, the chair spoke about earlier, about the average number of days that payment is later than that required under the terms of the contract. We have noticed, and it is a well-known fact, that the payment to contractors as well as PSPs is a major problem within the state infrastructure clients. And this, what we have done is we have obtained this, we had conducted with the University of the Free State construction industry indicators since 2003, where we found that one of the indicators was the payment to contractors, and we could get a good idea in terms of who, in which sphere of government was the worst offenders. So it is one of these indexes in terms of how a client will be measured in terms of prompt payment. And what we also do, we are looking at the assessment of the supply chain management and procurement and delivery management officials, again, what like I said earlier, a competence framework for infrastructure procurement in terms of how, whether a infrastructure department has these officials in place or whether they don't. And again, what I also mentioned earlier is in terms of the client performance report, that you as a PSP or a contractor, you will now have the opportunity to assess the performance of a client in terms of their particular, whether the brief, whether they give you the funds, whether they manage the funds, whether they manage you properly, those type of things. But those are things that the CIDB will then further workshop with the industry. If one looks at the client performance index, there are quite a number of them, like I said, is listed, and it will have a scale, and then it will have a weighting. We need to look at how we're going to look in terms of the weighting, what is an acceptable score, what score is an unacceptable score, and that is the way forward in terms of. But the crux of the matter is we need to find the middle point where we reach a stage where infrastructure clients, they use the opportunity to use their funds with the skills so that you as service providers, as professional service providers and contractors, you are sustainable. You can, and also where you support these infrastructure clients where need be. Chair, again, I am stuck here with this one. There we go. In terms of the concluding remarks, the CIDB itself is having ongoing capacitation of the SEM officials as well as the procurement delivery officials. We also will capacitate the private sector PSPs yourselves. The CIDB has a build program, which is part of the project assessment scheme, which are now collecting funds from clients on each project above a threshold, and we will use that funds to develop the industry. And this is one of the areas that the CIDB is going to apply those funds to assist government as well as the industry so that we can roll out those projects. And then also in terms of the amendment of the CIDB Act, we are currently reviewing and amending the Act. It is with the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. It's in an advanced stage, and we're including the client recognition scheme. And as well as we have developed the draft client performance reports, which we will share with you, we'll workshop with you as industry, because we need to pilot and test it with you. And that is my presentation in terms of the client recognition scheme. Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kasim. I think it was a very, very great presentation, and we now follow the developments in terms of what the CIDB is doing to promote the infrastructure delivery in our country. So thank you very much. So please stick around for our Q&A session immediately after our last speaker has delivered his presentation. I'm going to invite the last speaker for the day, who is none other than Mr. McDonald Maluleke, who is the Chief Procurement Officer at Transnet Freight Rail. He is a seasoned SAM executive with solid experience in strategic sourcing, category management, tactical procurement, logistics, and warehousing. He has over 23 years experience in SAM with excellent leadership skills across the entire SAM value chain. The stage is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your indulgence. I somehow missed the instructions that I mustn't use my iPad. I must only use the PC. So I'm now logged into the PC. And yes, thanks once more again, Program Director and CESA for the invite, and the delegates, good afternoon. I know I'm standing between you and your afternoon commute, so I'm not going to be long, I promise. I only have 7 slides that I'm going to talk you through. If we can go to the first slide. Thank you very much. So this slide shows the public infrastructure spend for the South African government. That includes all the state-owned entities, including your PRASA, Transnet, and the data was extracted from CESA and National Treasury. And it's the spent on public infrastructure for the past 3 financial years. And you can see on the slides that transport is one area where the spend is the highest, and it has been the case in the past 3 financial years. And if you also look at the contribution of the rail transport in terms of employment, 16,000 jobs for PRASA alone. And if you then add the close to 58,000 Transnet numbers, you get closer to 74,000 that is employed in the transport sector of the public sector. And then the public infrastructure is a key enabler to economic growth because the more we spend on public infrastructure, that's when new jobs are created. And there's more money circulating in the economy and stimulates economic growth. There's a marginal change in spend in the past 3 financial years on all sectors, but you can see now the spend is still looking good for 2020, 2021, even though we haven't finished 2020, 2021, it was 77 billion. This is driven by spend from PRASA, Transnet, which indicates a continued focus in this sector of infrastructure by government. And the increase in infrastructure spend will drive increases in industrialization and localization, where most of the goods that we need are manufactured locally instead of us importing. However, this will require efficient procurement processes. I think both Dr. Altman touched on it, and also Mark Steiner in their presentation, that it is important to have an efficient public procurement system. On the next slide, then we talk about the leakages and inefficiencies within the procurement and delivery of public infrastructure projects, that erodes the economic impact. And there's mainly 5 things that we need to really zoom into and see how best we can address them. And the first one is around the public sector premium. This is my 3rd SOC that I'm working for. And in almost all 3 of them, there is this mindset in the supply industry that if you're dealing with government, government has money, so it's okay to inflate your prices a bit because they will pay, and that is eroding a lot of value. The other thing is the use of middlemen, because either the OEMs are not interested because of the strict governance regime that SOCs have to adhere to, and they simply don't bid. Then we end up dealing with middlemen who also add their profit margins. And lastly, there is an issue of corruption. I think the revelations of the recent past in your Zondo Commission bears testimony to this, that there is a serious problem of graft and malfeasance in the public space that we have to seriously address as South Africans and as SOCs. And the second issue is the high regulatory burden on public procurement with regards to infrastructure that I've already touched on. As SOCs, we have to adhere to various legislative prescripts, so PFMA, triple PFA, NIP, National Treasury directives, parliamentary proclamations that are issued from time to time, and all of that has put a strain on the effectiveness and efficiency of the public procurement space. the rules themselves were introduced, for good intentions. When there's corruption in one area, you introduce a new directive that says if you want to extend the contract by a certain value, you have to go to National Treasury. Intentions, perfect. But the application thereof, it means now there's no agility in that space, because you have to submit this thing, wait for a few weeks, if not months, before National Treasury gives you a nod. And the other issue is around the poor or non-delivery from the OEMs and also subcontractors. In some cases, most of the public sector procurement departments, we're lacking when it comes to contract management. That's one area that we're strongly focusing on at Transnet to try and improve. And we are also beefing up our project management capability to ensure that when we conclude contracts, we are able to extract maximum value based on the commitments that were made at the tendering stage. If you don't have a strong contract management and project management leg, that's when you leave a lot of value on the table. And the structuring of post-transaction services, and that also talks to things like extracting value on the signed contracts that I touched on, documenting learnings on each procurement event so that you don't end up repeating the same mistake on the next tender. And also sharing and doing proper contract closeout. So if one SOC does a procurement event and there's certain learnings that are documented, those learnings should be shared with other SOCs so that they also don't make the same mistake. And lastly, there is the requirement of the 30% subcontracting, that is required as per PPPFA. Look at the intentions behind it, excellent, because it talks to uplifting the EMEs, QSEs, Black-owned companies, Black youth-owned, Black women-owned. But there are also unintended consequences when it comes to legislation such as those. Also contribute to premium, because if the primary contractor is then forced, because the tender is above a certain threshold, which is 30 million, to subcontract, they will add a bit of a premium to make up for the 30%. There is also the possibility that the process might be abused in some cases, where certain subcontractors will be insisted upon the contractors, and for corruption means. And also it also erodes the accountability of the primary contractor if they are forced to do subcontracting to an extent of 30%, and there's no delivery. In some cases, they've come back and say it's because of you're insisting that I must subcontract 30% of my work, so you can't hold me accountable for everything. My 70% was good, but the 30% that the subcontractor was doing is the one that is of a substandard quality. So the intention is good, but we need to find a way to balance, efficiency and empowerment. And then, what all of this does is that they reduce capital that could be spent on other initiatives if you end up paying a premium. May cause delays in project implementation and project execution, result in substandard work, like the example that I gave, where the primary contractor will say, is that guy that I had to give 30% of the work to, who didn't deliver up to spec. I've done my part, even though the expectation is that the primary contractor has to be responsible for delivery. And also the issue of corruption, which has happened, is well documented in the commission investigating state capture, that certain subcontracting arrangements were repurposed for other nefarious reasons. So that's one area that we also strongly focusing on as SOCs when it comes to procurement of public infrastructure. And on the next slide, we talk of the socio-economic benefit model, due to public infrastructure spend, and we give an example on the on the energy sector, where if you spend 66 billion in energy and water, public infrastructure spend, the rippling effect thereof is around 77 billion due to the jobs that are created and the jobs that are retained in that sector, additional value added in the economy, additional government revenue in terms of taxes, increase in salaries and wages, increase in household income. In some cases, there was no income, but because of the job creation that comes from this, infrastructure spend, jobs are created. And also the issue of skills development. The 30% subcontracting is not all bad, because one of the good things that it does is that the smaller players are able to learn from the bigger players in terms of skills transfer during contract execution. We have had some successes where the contractors started as EMEs, and now they are sitting as large enterprises. And there's also local content requirements on each sector. Energy and water is 40%, transport 25%, and other is 25%. So what local content really means is that if there is procurement of anything that comes from outside, we insist on a certain percentage that it needs to be spent locally. And this is a designation by the DTIC. And then on the next slide, we talk of then the challenges, in using SCM to realize economic value. And there's lengthy business case and capital allocation processes that may lead to point of delays and even obsoleteness. When business cases have to be approved in the public sector space, they go through a rigorous process. Drafting, there's various approvals that have to be, obtained, funding requirements, budget allocation, all of that take, a couple of months to conclude. And in the meantime, opportunities might be lost in the market space. And what can be done to address this is to, adopt different sourcing methods, tactical procurement for your day-to-day, and strategic sourcing and category management for really, the procurement of capital projects. Use a collaborative approach and work in parallel, including in tendering. So the legislative regime that governs public procurement is quite strict. In some industries, you are able to bring your associations like your CESA very early in the process, your engineers to advise you on certain things. But in our case, you have to follow an open tender process before you can really engage someone. And that sometimes erodes value in that regard. And promote development of local manufacturing capacity. This is our ask to the industry and CESA. When you look at our engineering space, FEL1 up to FEL3, we are quite good, as the South African industry. But when it comes to the project execution stage, we tend to rely more on either imported services or service providers that are, appointed international. So that's one area that we need to develop. And I normally give an example that if I were to look for a consulting engineer to come and design a rail network, I'll find plenty. But once that I've got the designs, I know what to procure, and I now need to procure the rail material, whether it's your turnouts, your rails, all of that are manufactured overseas. So then you have to deal with a different dynamic because there's no one that can manufacture those locally. So that's one capacity that we need to develop, so that we don't only design, but we can also design and build, so that when we run a turnkey project, we are able to find one organization that can do end-to-end services. So that's one area that we really asking that we really need to focus on. It pains us that the jobs that could have been created locally the money is spent overseas because local capacity does not exist. And then, this will make an impact on job creation, because once you start manufacturing more, that's when you are able to create more jobs in the local economy. And the growth and economic growth and alleviating poverty really lies in us not only being a consuming nation, but also producing, manufacturing locally, what we are able to use, and not only for consumption, but also for export. So we really need to focus on. And then lastly is the early involvement of procurement, in business case development. A lot of times the engineering part will design, draft and get approval on a business case with very little involvement from procurement. And once that has been approved and the business case is given to procurement to implement, a lot of times there's no sufficient time, and the accusation is that procurement is not agile enough. Meanwhile, the involvement came at the very tail end of the process. If it happened earlier, then it could have been a different story. And then, as a chief procurement officer, it would be, amiss of me not to talk to the next two slides, which is, a subject that keeps me busy on most days, talking to the suppliers, the potential bidders who want to try and understand, how do we do business with Transnet? Some even accuse us of not giving them a chance, or giving preference to certain companies because of lack of understanding of how we do our procurement. In the past, those who have interacted with us and other SOCs, we used to have our own supplier database, database of 3,000 or 6,000 suppliers. And whenever we would have a tender, we would go to that database and select a few from that database and advertise. But with the advent of the National Treasury e-tender portal, things have changed slightly. All the tenders, all the databases, they have moved over to the National Treasury CSD portal. So we no longer maintain a database as Transnet. So, if suppliers come to me and ask me to register them in our database, we have none. You have to get yourself registered on the CSD portal. And you also need to ensure that your tax affairs are in order. So this is also one of the area that creates a lot of frustration on the supplier side, because the SARS introduced the online portal where the entities, like your SOCs, can go in, log in, and check the supplier's tax compliance. So we no longer rely on that tax clearance that you used to give us to show whether you are tax compliant or not. We can log in and check. And if you're late for your VAT or your pay as you earn or any of the taxes that you have to pay, your status will reflect as non-compliant, and we are duty bound not to do business with companies that are non-tax compliant. So it is important that you advise your client organizations to ensure that their tax affairs are always in order when they do business with SOCs, and that registration on the central supplier database. And one thing that we want to emphasize is that there's no requirement to pay anything to register on these portals. You get suppliers asking how much must be paid, or some of them are even gone into paying money. There's no requirement whatsoever to pay anything. The registration on the CSD portal is free as long as you have a registered company at CIPC, your tax affairs are in order, and then you go and register yourself. And the other thing that is important is to ensure that you have a valid BBBE certificate. Some tenders are set aside for companies that have certain BBBE credentials. So it's important that you always have a valid BBBE certificate. If you are an EME, there's a requirement of the affidavit, sworn affidavit. So make sure that when you submit your bid, you submit with those. And then there's also a lot of fraudulent tenders that are circulating out there. Transnet is not immune to those kind of criminal activities where people would advertise tenders using a Transnet logo. These days, they even use the real buyer names, Jacob Mabunda, and you find that you do have a buyer with that name. But if you look at the phone number, it's wrong. And what they tend to do, they use a wrong email address. In Transnet, if I'm Jacob Mabunda, my email address will be jacob.mabunda@transnet.net. But they will have Transnets or Transnet Freight Rail or Transnet tenders. Once you see those things, there must be a red flag. And the other obvious red flag is the use of pictures. So they will say Transnet is looking for this substation equipment, then they put a nice picture there in color. We don't do that. When we advertise our tender, we put a technical specification because that is what will help the supplier to understand what it is that we're looking for. We don't put a picture. So they go to the internet and look for that thing, download it and put it on that thing. And there's been a lot of suppliers that have been defrauded in that regard. So just be careful of not falling foul to that. And like I said, there's no requirement to pay anything, whether you want to submit a tender or you want to register on the CSD portal. And on the last slide, we talked to what Transnet stands for, that we do not tolerate corruption, and we urge our clients and suppliers and the general public to report any fraud or corruption to the tip-off anonymous number. And if you happen to receive a tender in your inbox that looks suspicious, before you do anything, rather phone this number and say, this is what I've received. Is it legit? There are suppliers that have fallen victim to such scams. And if you are asked to pay money, whether by a procurement official, procurement executive, or anyone for that matter, in order to win a tender, please contact this number, provide the details, who, what, when, so that the matter can be properly investigated, because there's no requirement whatsoever to pay any monies to win any tenders. Our tenders are won on merit and merit only. So we use the triple PFA, 80-20 and 90-10. If you meet the technical specification and you give us a good price, you shouldn't have problems. If at any time you are asked to pay anything, it's a red flag. It needs to be reported so that it can be properly investigated. If you happen to engage in, Chair, I'm done. If you happen to pay bribes or whatever, and you are caught, there is a risk that your company will be restricted from doing business with all the SOCs for a maximum period of up to 10 years. So paying kickbacks is not without consequences, and we strongly discourage that. Thank you very much, Program Director. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Mr. Morulek. I think your presentation was very interesting. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us for the Q&A session. Shall we perhaps start with Ishmael, as you have indicated that the CIDB, will be focusing on a recognition scheme, for some of your clients. So the question that I have here is, what sort of intervention are you going to come up with for those clients that are found to be underperforming? Because we have seen that the majority of the clients, especially in local government environment, were found, especially when you look at the Auditor General's report, it's clear that the majority of them are not able to perform to the level expected. So what sort of interventions are you going to come up with to encourage them to live up to the expectations?
First of all, thank you, Chair. With the intervention, once we have obtained the results in terms of identifying who those underperforming clients are, we would then discuss it with these clients in terms of the procurement officers, for instance, and procurement infrastructure delivery manager. We will then look at how we can assist them. For example, currently we are doing client capacitation, but it's on a very small scale. we are now going on a drive. Like I said, the CIDB is also has started now in April with the project assessment scheme, which we call BUILD, and that collects a fund. And through that fund, we will capacitate both private and public sector professionals so that they can assist these clients in terms of delivery, in terms of infrastructure. Now, the second one is that would be the initial stage. Then it is also the requirement of the CIDB to report these non-performing or low-performing clients to the respective authority in terms of whether it is National Treasury, whether it is, for example, the whatever power in terms of if it is an agency, they will have a department, for example, Department of Transport, for instance. But most importantly, it will be a National Treasury issue because they disburse these funds. So it will be through that link, and that would then enable National Treasury or the power that's responsible for these municipalities, for example, whether it is a local municipality, district municipality, and the like, will then be assisted, and that is the plan, so that they can then hold a hand in terms of developing these infrastructure projects. As you've seen, there's a huge deficit in terms of spending, and that has to be addressed because it has roll-on effects in terms of service provider sustainability as well as contractor sustainability. So those are the short-term impacts. But first of all, we have to get the act amended as well. But we have developed for example, the performance reports. We are now going to pilot that. So the interventions will come, but it takes time. So it is a time. It's not tomorrow. It is not next year. Perhaps in the next 2 years, for instance. That is how we're going to get the interventions done there. But it is definitely not also just not a CIDB solo. We'll have partners with industry, and that is how we're going to do it.
Yeah, so fantastic. So I see that there's going to be a lot of data generated. You mentioned that the clients, are required to submit some of their performance reports to the National Treasury, and you also have access to some of the information from your own databases. So I take it that for you to really make sense out of all this information, you need to have a lot of data analytics capability, and not just data analytics capability. It has to be informed by the right professionals. So do you have the capacity, or what sort of plans do you have to scale up the capacity required to be able to do this type of work?
Okay, first of all, the CIDB has an established register of projects. So the bulk of the data will be generated automatically in terms of systems. But as you said, you have to have the analytics behind it. And we will jack up, we will increase our officials within the CIDB, because there has to be reports generated, interpretation, investigations, for example, why. For example, you'll have, for instance, social issues, for instance. There are reasons why the municipalities perhaps haven't spent. So those are the investigations behind the scenes that the CIDB will undertake. It will not just be a pure plain cut automatic and a mechanical process, but basically it is an automated process via the register of projects, which is a very powerful tool which the CIDB hasn't really used effectively. And we will also use National Treasury more effectively. And in terms of what the technology, we will share databases and those type of issues. So we will automate. That will cut a lot of the manual analytics out of it.
All right, thank you for that. There's a question here, and the theme of the question is around QBS. So I take it it's directed at Mark. So the question is, the QBS appears to be a great concept and probably the correct way to go to enhance service delivery. How does training and capacitation of new entrants into the sector occur through this framework? Would you comment on that?
Yes, please. Competition we've seen has actually been enhanced, but how does a new entrant? There are many different new entrants. A lot of our firms are formed by experienced people who spin off and form their own firms. There's they are in demand because of the experience they bring, and they can put that towards the qualifications requirements. There's a lot of teaming because each project is different, each locale is different, as we've talked before. It requires teaming of different firms, and that's why I keep referring to offerer, because the offerer is the team, not usually just one entity. Usually the new firms will team with others to get experience with a client. Sometimes they feel that they have brought such good talent that they will actually use some of the larger firms as subcontractors on their team. As far as training and capacity building, let me just say that because QBS allows the margins to be higher, allows the firms to encourage new talent in their hiring and through their benefits and all that. That allows the new firms to actually grow fairly quickly, especially if they've got local knowledge. One of the things that a lot of the clients, especially the governmental clients, is they like to have people with local knowledge, whether it's specific technical knowledge about the soils or the weather, or just understanding the local regulations and requirements to be part of a team. So there's a lot there. And because price is not the selection factor, you don't get overwhelmed by firms who maybe have the size to accept some contracts just to get into a market and lose money on it, things along that line. So we've seen a lot of new entrants. I don't know if that answers the question fully, but the studies have shown that new entrants come into the market much easier under QBS than when there's a price selection.
All right, thank you. I'm sure we would have heard from Ismail when he presented, and he spoke about some of the criticism that they get as the CIDB, that, why do we still have inefficiencies in our procurement processes while our procurement frameworks and models, are so clear. So I would want to ask you, from the American context, what are some of the criticisms that you get from the industry, as a result of your QBS framework?
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually most of the criticism we get is from firms that have developed a long-term relationship with an individual client, especially some of the cities and all that, and they don't understand why process allows new entrants, people from other with reasonable experience to compete against them. They would like a sole source contract, and even some of the municipalities and all that say, "Oh, we know this guy, we want to give him the work," and all that. So that's about the biggest criticism we get is, as the business association of the industry, we feel that that's actually a positive, and we try to explain to both municipalities and to the firms why it's in their best interests not to be continuously the sole source and not letting new people into the marketplace. As far as other criticisms, I think from what I've seen, we've got 6,000 member firms, but there are a lot more firms out there, but we represent almost all the firms that do public sector work, and they champion QPS at every possible discussion.
All right. Thank you so much for that response. It was very interesting and it generated a few questions. And maybe the question is, you spoke about the rules and the compliance, the burden for you, as the management system to be able to deal with all these new rules that are really meant, with good intentions. Obviously, if you don't comply with these compliance requirements, there's a problem with the audit outcome. So how do you deal with that to avoid, having undesired negative or undesired audit outcomes?
Excellent question, Program Director. So we have no choice but to comply. However, there are discussions that are in the pipeline that we will be having with our regulators in terms of applying for exemptions on certain provisions. Because if you look at the PFMA was really designed for government departments, and very often than not, those government departments compete with no one on the services that they offer. They've got a monopoly. But with us, we compete with the private sector. If they can make a decision 1 in the afternoon and we have to take 3 months to make that decision, you can imagine what happens to our revenue streams and the type of services that we want to offer. If I have to repair my infrastructure and I have to procure certain things, but I have to follow a very rigorous procurement process, that is going to take me months, but my counterparts in the private sector can complete that procurement event in 3 weeks' time. By the time I finish procuring, they have already had my lunch and that opportunity is gone. So there are those engagements. Some have already started. Some are in the pipeline to say, what is it that we need to comply to as an SOC that will not hamstring us to become agile. Thanks.
All right. I must ask you about, the subcontractors at the local community level. And you also mentioned that, the main contractors, they are still, held liable, for the work, even though some of the work is outsourced to some of the subcontractors. So clearly, this practice is unfair to the main contractor. And the reality is we'll always have, these local subcontractors as stakeholders to the projects, because without really recognizing them, we will not be able to move an inch. What would your comment be in terms of reviewing our procurement framework to try and empower, the local subcontractors and also to protect the main contractors from some of the, the failures, I should say, as a result of working with some of the local, subcontractors?
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. Indeed, subcontracting is still necessary, and it has been happening in the past. But what was absent in the past was the prescription to say if a tender is above 30 million, you need to have 30% subcontracting, even though the regulation says where feasible. But where there are opportunities, then you are forced to do the 30% subcontracting. And in some cases, you'll find an entity that is still developing, coming back to say, but I'm still a developing entity. And you are giving me this 35 million rand project, but you are expecting me to take 30% of that and give it to someone else. You are disempowering me. And it's very difficult to argue with that logic. So it needs to be there, but the prescription must be relaxed so that we can say on this one, ideally we can get to 20%. And the primary contractor will feel that is something which is realistic and is achievable and it's not putting a strain on their service delivery. And there will be skills transfer in that regard. But when you do it through a cost arrangement where you say, if you don't, you are disqualified, they will do it, but the skills transfer will not happen. there's no empowerment at the end. These guys, they end up not having developed anything. They can't do any project on their own. So we need to really look at the prescription that says thou shalt do 30% and say, let's put the relaxation, and there must be discretion where we can say on this one, maybe 10% because of the nature of the service. On this one, maybe we can push it up to 35% because of the nature of the service. So that collaboration needs to be there so that the primary contractors don't feel like they are doing it with a gun against their head. Thanks.
All right. So thank you, Mr. Maluleke, for sharing your insights about the infrastructure procurement challenges and initiatives that forms part of the Transnet ecosystem. You have also emphasized value for money, like Mr. Kasim, from the CIDB. So I'm sure the industry appreciates that we really need to collaborate and ensure that in our partnership, there's always, value for money in whatever we do. And let me also thank all the speakers. I'm not going to spend too much time. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Ishmael. Thanks, Dr. Altman, for really spending time with us this afternoon. Let me take this opportunity to thank the delegates as well for being with us up until this time. Apologies for overrunning, and let me hand over to Chris for final closing remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And once again, we extend a big thank you to our panelists for their insightful knowledge sharing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of what has been a full, engaging, and informative day. But I think it's now a good time for a prize. We are giving away a 4-day course sponsored by the School of Consulting Engineering. It is a project management professional, PMP course for built environment professionals with 4 CPD points. Its cost is around just under 9,000 Rand, but I think its value is way beyond that amount. So we've selected the names from our guests who've participated participated the most during the sessions. We have loaded your names into this wheel of fortune, and I'm now going to spin the wheel to see who the lucky winner is. And let's go for it. Okay, and the winner is Mr. Jan Louis Reinders. Congratulations, Jan Louis. We have your contact details, and your prize will be confirmed with you. And congratulations for that lucky spin. And I hope that you use the knowledge that you may gain from the course now and well into the future as we grow our next generation of engineering practitioners and project managers. So, ladies and gentlemen, from myself, Chris Campbell, it is time to bid you farewell and officially close out day 1 of the CESA Infrastructure Virtual Indaba 2021. We trust you found today's session valuable and thought-provoking. We do thank you once again for your engagement and comments in the chat. Tomorrow, of course, we have another bumper day of insights and perspectives from industry leaders and colleagues around the world. And we look forward to welcoming you to tomorrow's program. The session starts tomorrow at 10 o'clock, and we refer to it as Central African time. And that's just in case we have any colleagues who may be on the eastern side of the continent or the western side of the continent, or a lot further afield where we do have different time zones. At this point, I would like to bid you a good afternoon and a good evening. And I look forward to having you back tomorrow. Goodbye for now, and enjoy the rest of your day.